By the time the last plank came free of the Marigold's hull, it was already March, and the boatyard smelled of thawing brine and cedar shavings, and he was alone the way he had been alone for 6 months, which is to say, entirely and without complaint. He did not know yet that his hands, raw from sanding and cold water, were about to close around $3 million in gold and silver that had been waiting under that keel for the better part of 2 decades. He only knew that the wood beneath the false plank sounded wrong when he tapped it, a hollow, patient echo, like something holding its breath. He would remember, later, that it was raining that morning, a thin, gray New England rain that beaded on the tarp above his workbench, and that his coffee had gone cold in its thermos an hour before he ever thought to drink it. That discovery is still months away from where this story properly begins, and there is a version of it, the version his aunt and uncle told at dinner parties for years afterward, in the clipped, amused tone people use for family embarrassments, that starts and ends with a rusted boat and a laugh. But the truer version starts earlier, in early October, in a white clapboard house on the Massachusetts coast that smelled of salt and camphor and, underneath it, faintly of the pipe tobacco his grandfather had quit 30 years before and never quite stopped smelling like. The old man died on a Tuesday at 81, in the same upstairs bedroom where he had been born, with the tide going out below the bluff exactly as it had every evening of his life. He had built, over 60 years, a shipping and logistics empire worth some $40 million on paper, trucks, warehouses, a fleet of cargo vessels bearing the family name in blue paint on white hulls. None of that was on his mind at the end, or so the hospice nurse would later say, unprompted, to the grandson who had sat with him most nights that final year. What the old man asked about, in his last lucid hours, was whether the bilge pump on the Marigold had been drained for winter. It had. The grandson had drained it himself the previous Sunday, kneeling in cold water in the bottom of a boat that even then most of the family considered an eccentric old man's toy, a 1962 wooden trawler, 42 feet of graying hull and patched canvas, worth perhaps $11,000 to anyone who wasn't sentimental about it. He had spent every weekend of the past 11 years keeping that boat afloat, and had never once been asked, by anyone else in the family, why he bothered. He would be asked that question again soon, in a mahogany-paneled office in New Bedford, by people who meant it as an insult. But that morning, in the rain, with the old man's funeral only days behind them, he did not yet know how much that answer was worth. The funeral itself had been a study in proportion, and proportion, he would come to understand, was the family's native language. 400 people filled the Unitarian Church on County Street, and the reception afterward, held in a hotel ballroom overlooking the harbor, ran to a raw bar and a string quartet, and a slideshow that traced the old man's life across 60 years of shipping manifests and christenings and photographs of container vessels sliding into gray Atlantic water. There was no photograph of the Marigold. He had looked. He had not expected to find one, and told himself the absence meant nothing, though later he would understand it meant a great deal, that the family's memory of the man they buried was already, before the ground had settled, a curated and simplified thing, scrubbed of whatever did not serve the story of a fortune well made and soon to be well spent. His aunt had worn black Chanel and had cried exactly enough. His uncle, her husband of 26 years, had given a eulogy that mentioned the company 4 times and the boat not at all, though he had certainly seen it, had, in fact, once suggested at a 4th of July gathering that his father-in-law finally let that thing go before it embarrasses somebody. The old man had laughed at that, a short laugh with no warmth in it, and changed the subject to something else entirely, and the grandson, who had been standing near enough to hear, had understood even then that something had been decided in that moment and simply not spoken aloud. He drove back to the boatyard the morning after the funeral because he did not know what else to do with his hands. The rain had not let up in 3 days, and the tarp over the Marigold's foredeck had pooled with water he had to push off with a broom handle before it collapsed the frame. He climbed aboard anyway, the way he had climbed aboard nearly every Saturday for 11 years, and sat for a while in the wheelhouse where the old man used to sit with 2 cups of coffee going cold on the console, one for each of them, and talk about nothing: tides, the price of diesel, a woman he'd loved before the grandson's grandmother, gone 40 years now and still spoken of with a tenderness the family's official history had no room for. It was there, in the wheelhouse, with the rain drumming on rotted plywood he had been meaning to replace since spring, that he first noticed how strange it was that a man who had spent a lifetime moving cargo across oceans had insisted, every year, on personally overseeing the winterizing of a boat worth less than his monthly dry cleaning bill. He did not think much of it then. There was a reading of the will in 4 days, and lawyers, he had been told, preferred people to arrive on time. The morning of the reading came in gray and close, the kind of New England autumn day where the sky seems to have forgotten how to commit to weather. He dressed in the one jacket he owned that didn't smell of diesel and drove the 40 minutes into New Bedford with the truck's heater rattling and the radio off, because he found he had nothing he wanted to hear. The law office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building near the harbor, the kind of place that had been receiving families like his for generations and had the mahogany to prove it. Dark paneling gone nearly black with a century of varnish, brass fixtures polished by hands long dead, a smell of old paper and lemon oil that seemed to hush people before they'd said a word. He arrived 11 minutes early and was made to wait 40, which gave him time to notice the portraits on the walls, stern men in high collars who had presumably done to their own children what his grandfather's children had, eventually, learned to do to each other. His aunt arrived in a camel coat that had never seen rain, her husband a half step behind her checking his phone, his uncle last, smelling faintly of scotch though it was not yet 11. None of them looked at him directly. This had become, over the past 6 years, its own kind of fluency between them, a way of occupying a room together without acknowledging that the other person in it had spent every one of those years driving to a hospital, then a hospice, then a graveside, while they had sent flowers and once a card. The attorney who finally opened the door to receive them was a small, careful man near 70, with the unhurried courtesy of someone who had buried more of a family's certainties than its members ever suspected. He shook each hand in turn, lingering, the grandson thought, a half-second longer on his. It could have meant nothing. He filed it away anyway, the way he filed away every small irregularity in an engine before deciding whether it was worth worrying about. They were shown to a conference room with a long table and 4 chairs already set, a 5th added almost as an afterthought near the door. His, evidently, though no one said so. Rain had started against the tall windows, thin and steady, the kind that would still be falling on the Marigold's tarp when he got back to it that evening, patient and indifferent to whatever was about to be said in this room. The attorney opened a leather folder with the unhurried gravity of a man who had done this 1,000 times and still respected what it cost the people sitting in front of him. "Before we begin," he said, "I should tell you that your father left very specific instructions about the order in which this document is to be read." His aunt's mouth tightened, almost imperceptibly, into something that was not quite a smile. "Specific instructions," the uncle repeated, as though tasting a word he suspected of being spoiled. He was 81, not eccentric. The attorney did not look up from the folder. He had the particular patience of a man who had buried more of a family's illusions than its members, and he let the silence stretch until it did its own quiet work. Outside, the rain thickened by degrees, drawing gray lines down the window behind him, and somewhere below on Union Street, a delivery truck idled long enough that its engine became part of the room's furniture. A low mechanical hum the grandson found himself listening to, instead of the small, brittle noises his aunt made shifting in her chair. He noticed he had stopped fidgeting with the envelope in his pocket. He noticed, too, that his uncle's shoe was tapping, once, twice, an irregular rhythm, the kind that in an engine would mean something was about to fail. The attorney began, at last, with the preamble, the standard language of sound mind and considered judgment, of revoking all prior wills and codicils, phrases so formal they seemed to belong to another century, and yet his aunt leaned forward at each clause, as though bracing for a wave. The uncle's husband, seated slightly apart with his arms crossed over a suit that had clearly been chosen for the occasion, checked his watch twice in the span of a paragraph. It was a small thing. The grandson filed it away too. To my son and daughter, the attorney read, I leave the entirety of my interest in the company, together with all associated real estate holdings, in equal share, to be divided as they and their counsel see fit. He paused only long enough to let the number attached to that sentence, spoken aloud now, plainly, $40 million, give or take, settle into the room like weather. His aunt exhaled, the first easy breath she had taken since sitting down. His uncle's shoulders dropped a visible half-inch. Something passed between them that was not quite triumph, not quite relief, but close enough to both, that the grandson understood, watching it, that some part of this meeting had already been decided in their minds, long before they'd walked in. The attorney turned a page. The room did not yet know to hold its breath differently for what came next, and so it didn't. His aunt was already murmuring something about the Newport property to her husband, already elsewhere, already spending, while the old man at the head of the table found, without hurry, the second bequest, the one written in his father's own private arithmetic, the one that had nothing to do with balance sheets at all. The attorney read the second bequest the way a man reads scripture he has read 1,000 times before and still believes in, slowly, without inflection, letting each word arrive whole. To my grandson, he said, I leave the vessel Marigold, a 1962 wooden-hulled trawler, currently docked at Slip 14, together with all tools, equipment, and effects belonging to her. He did not look up right away. When he did, it was toward the grandson, not the siblings, as though some old habit of deference had reasserted itself for just that moment. There was a silence of the particular kind that follows an insult before the room has fully agreed to recognize it as one. His uncle recovered first. The boat, he repeated, as if the word itself might be a mistranslation. That's it? That old thing's been rotting at the dock for years. Dad barely had the money to keep the slip paid, let alone the boat itself. He said it lightly, almost kindly, the way a man corrects a child who has misheard a number. His aunt did not bother with lightness. Well, she said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt, at least he'll have something to do with his weekends now. A small laugh escaped her husband, quickly swallowed, not quite fast enough. The grandson said nothing. He had spent enough winters standing on a cold hull with his grandfather, sanding, scraping, waiting out engine trouble in the rain, to know that silence, properly held, could outlast almost any room. He kept his eyes on the attorney instead of on them, watching the old man's hand move to the final item in the folder, a plain envelope, sealed, his grandfather's handwriting slanting faintly across the front in blue ink gone slightly gray with age. There is also this, the attorney said, which your grandfather asked me to give you directly, and only you, at the conclusion of the reading. He slid it across the mahogany, past the polished pens and the water glasses no one had touched, until it rested in front of the grandson like something almost apologetic in its smallness. His aunt glanced at it with the mild, already bored curiosity of someone checking the time. A letter, she said, to no one in particular. How touching. She had already turned half away, murmuring again to her husband about closing dates, about which broker to call first, about whether the Newport house would need staging or could go straight to market as is. The grandson did not open the envelope there. He held it the way he might have held something still warm from an engine, carefully, aware of its heat before he understood its shape, and slid it into his coat pocket while the lawyer continued speaking of transfer dates and probate timelines that no longer seemed to concern him at all. Outside the tall windows, the New Bedford sky had gone the color of wet slate, and somewhere past the harbor, past the rooftops, the Marigold sat low and patient in her slip, waiting, as she always had, for him to come back and finish what they'd started. The reading concluded the way most business concludes now, with the small violence of signatures and the shuffle of paper being squared against a desk edge. His uncle stood first, buttoning his jacket with the brisk satisfaction of a man leaving a meeting that had gone exactly as he'd expected. "Well," he said, extending a hand toward the lawyer that was not quite offered to the grandson at all, "I think we can call that settled." He did not look toward the boat mechanic again. There was no reason to. The boy had gotten his boat and his letter, and there was nothing left in the room worth his attention. The aunt's husband lingered only long enough to murmur something to the lawyer about tax basis and depreciation schedules, words that fell into the mahogany air like small, dry coins. Then the three of them were gone, their footsteps receding down the carpeted hallway, already discussing, in voices pitched for each other and no one else, whether the shipping offices should be repainted before the annual meeting. The grandson remained a moment longer, alone with the lawyer, who was gathering papers with the unhurried care of a man who had performed this same ritual for other families, other deaths, for 4 decades running. "He asked me to tell you something," the lawyer said, not looking up, "only if you didn't ask first." He paused, as though weighing whether the boy had earned it by his silence. He said the boat wasn't the small part of the will. He said it was the only part that mattered. The lawyer closed his folder. "I don't know what that means. I imagine you might, eventually." The grandson said nothing. He thought of his grandfather's hands, spotted and thick-knuckled, guiding his own smaller ones along a rope line 20 years earlier, patient in a way none of the man's own children had ever managed to learn. He thought of the smell of diesel and low tide, of coffee gone cold in a thermos passed back and forth across a workbench built from a salvaged hatch cover. He did not think, yet, of gold. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest, needling the windshield of his truck as he pulled away from the curb, past the brick facades and wrought iron of downtown New Bedford, down toward the water, where the air turned to salt, and the streets narrowed, and the gulls wheeled low over the working docks. He parked where he always parked. He walked the familiar plank gangway where he always walked, and there she was, the Marigold, rain darkening her hull, riding low and unbothered in her slip, exactly as she had for 62 years, waiting for someone who knew how to listen to old wood. He climbed aboard without hesitation, the way a man returns to a house he has never stopped living in, and it was only then, standing on her weathered deck with the rain running cold down his collar, that he finally reached into his coat and opened the envelope. The paper had been folded twice, and the fold lines had gone soft with handling, as though the old man had taken it out more than once before sealing it for good. The handwriting was smaller than he remembered, the letters leaning hard to the right the way they always did when his grandfather wrote in a hurry or in pain, and by October of that year it had likely been both. 9 words, no signature flourish, no explanation, nothing that a lawyer could read aloud in a mahogany room and call an asset. "Finish what we started. You'll know when." He read it 3 times, standing there in the rain, the ink already starting to bleed faintly where the water found the paper's edge, and each time the words meant less and more at once, the way instructions from the dead always do, too plain to be a puzzle, too strange to be nothing. He did not know, yet, what he was supposed to finish. He assumed, reasonably, that it meant the hull work they'd left half done the previous spring, the starboard planking near the waterline that had gone soft and gray, the kind of rot a man puts off because the boat still floats, and there is always next season. He folded the note back along its own worn creases and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, against his chest, the way he might have carried a photograph. He stood a long while on the deck before he went below, letting the rain do what it does to a man who has just buried someone, not comfort him exactly, but give him permission to feel nothing in particular for a few minutes, to simply be wet and cold and alive, while someone he loved was neither. The Marigold rocked gently under him, patient as she had always been, patient as she would need to be for months yet. Somewhere past the breakwater a horn sounded, flat and distant, and gulls scattered off a piling. He did not think about the aunt's voice yet, the way it had cut across the lawyer's office not 2 hours before. That would come later, replaying itself uninvited while he lay in bed at night. He did not think about the beach house key he would be asked to return within the week, or the calls that would stop coming, or the particular silence of a family closing ranks around money. Right now there was only the boat, and the rain finding the back of his neck, and 9 words folded against his heart that meant, he was almost certain, nothing more than an old man's fondness for unfinished projects. He went below to check the bilge pump, the way he always did, the way he had done every week for 11 years, not yet understanding that the note in his pocket was not sentiment. It was instruction. The bilge pump clicked on, then off, then on again, a rhythm he could have hummed in his sleep. He crouched by the engine box with a flashlight between his teeth, running his palm along a seam of caulking he had redone 3 summers ago, and found it dry. Good. One less thing. He would learn, in the months that followed, to measure his days by such small mercies. A dry seam, a starting engine, a tide that came in gentle instead of hard, because the larger mercies had stopped arriving. Already, though he did not know it yet, the machinery of exile had begun turning. 40 minutes north, in a kitchen with imported Italian tile and a view of a golf course, the aunt was on the phone with a locksmith, arranging to have the beach house rekeyed by Friday. She used the word precaution. She did not use the word nephew. The uncle, 2 rooms away, was already on a call to the company's chief financial officer, his voice carrying the particular brightness men use when they are pretending a death has not interrupted a quarter's projections. None of this reached the boat. What reached the boat was rain, and the smell of diesel and brine, and the specific ache of a body that had spent a week sitting in hospital chairs and now did not know what to do with its hands. He gave his hands the pump housing to clean. He gave them the rust along the exhaust manifold to scrape. He worked past dark with a trouble light clipped to the rail, and it did not occur to him, working, that he was rehearsing for a winter that would ask this exact discipline of him. Day job, night boat, no family, over and over, for 6 months, until the rehearsal became simply his life. He surfaced sometime near 9, joints stiff, and sat a while on the overturned bucket he kept for exactly this purpose, listening to the harbor settle. A trawler 2 slips down idled out past the breakwater, running lights small and orange in the mist. Somewhere a marine radio muttered weather he wasn't listening to. He took the envelope from his jacket again, not to reread it. He had it by heart already. 9 words is not much to memorize. But to hold it, the way a man holds a thing he suspects he does not yet understand. Finish what we started. Started what? He wondered. The engine rebuild, maybe? The new plank stock stacked under a tarp behind the yard shed, bought in August and never touched. He turned the paper over as if an answer might be written on the back in different ink, in a different mood, and found only the blank cream of good stationery, the kind his grandfather had ordered by the box from a stationer in New Bedford for 40 years, and never once used for anything as sentimental as a letter. He folded it away again and went to close up the wheelhouse for the night, and the rain kept coming, patient as the boat, patient as the winter that was already, quietly, arranging itself around him. The eviction, when it came, arrived by certified letter rather than by voice, which was, he would think later, exactly the kind of cruelty his aunt preferred. Bloodless, notarized, impossible to argue with. The beach house was being prepared for seasonal listing, the letter said, and any personal items remaining after the 15th would be considered abandoned. He read it twice at the kitchen counter that had never quite been his, in the gray light of a Tuesday morning, and felt less anger than a kind of tired recognition, as if he had been waiting for the paper to catch up to a decision already made weeks earlier in a mahogany office. He packed in an afternoon, it did not take long, a duffel of clothes, a toolbox that had been his own before it had ever been his grandfather's, the box of stationery he had, without quite deciding to, taken from the study desk before anyone thought to inventory it. He left the key on the counter, not hidden, not hurled, set down the way you set down something you are finished apologizing for. There was no scene. He had half expected one, had rehearsed in the truck what he might say if his aunt appeared in the driveway with her arms crossed. But she did not appear, and the house sat behind him in the mirror, looking exactly as composed as it always had, hedges trimmed, shutters the correct historical shade of blue, utterly indifferent to who slept inside it. He found a room above a hardware store in the old part of town, cheap enough on a mechanic's wage, cold enough in October that he kept a space heater running through the nights he wasn't at the yard. Mornings he worked the docks fixing outboards and diesel injectors for men who paid him in cash and did not ask about his family. Evenings he drove to the slip, unlocked the gate himself now. He had bought his own key, the old man's copy no longer his to use, and worked under a trouble light strung from the wheelhouse until his hands went stiff. The invitations, such as they were, stopped coming. No Thanksgiving mention, no holiday card, no call to ask how the boat was progressing, though he understood by now that no one but him wanted to know. 6 months would pass this way, he would later count them precisely, though at the time they did not feel like months at all. They felt like one long tide going out, slow and total, the water pulling back from a shore that had never quite belonged to him, leaving him alone with the boat, the tools, and 9 words he still did not fully understand, folded now inside the toolbox, close to hand, the way a man keeps a compass whose direction he trusts more than he trusts his own reading of the map. By November, the yard had gone the color of iron. Frost took the grass along the fence line each morning and did not fully release it until noon, and the men who kept boats there, retired trawlermen mostly, and a couple of hobbyists who came down on weekends to admire vessels they rarely sailed, had learned to leave him be, all but one, an old lobsterman named Elder Pomeroy, 70-some years old, with hands like weathered rope and a boat 2 slips down that he'd stopped taking out 2 winters prior, had taken to wandering over some evenings with a thermos of coffee he never quite offered to share, just held while he watched. "Marigold," he said once, reading the faded transom letters, not as a question. "Yes, sir." Knew the old man. Bought bait off him in 81, maybe 82. Didn't strike me as a man who'd leave his grandson a boat and 40 million to strangers. He said it without malice, the way a man states tide tables. Then he drank his coffee and did not elaborate, and the protagonist did not ask him to, because there was nothing yet to say that would not sound like bitterness dressed as fact. He was replacing the starboard chain plates that week, work that required patience more than strength, backing out corroded bolts a quarter turn at a time so as not to shear them, packing the new bedding compound by headlamp because the trouble light kept guttering in the wind off the harbor. His hands had split at the knuckles from the cold and the diesel solvent both, and he had started wrapping them in electrical tape before bed, a habit his grandfather used to mock, and then, in later years, adopt himself. He thought of that more than he expected to. Not the money, not the aunt's voice in the mahogany office, not even the will itself. Just the old man's taped knuckles, offered up in memory at odd hours, while he lay in the furnished room he now rented above a bait shop, listening to the radiator tick. He kept a ledger of his own that winter, cheap and spiral-bound, recording hours and materials the way his grandfather always had for the boat, an inherited habit, unconscious, until he caught himself doing it one December night and sat back on his heels, surprised. 22 hours, chain plates and hull scraping, it read. Bought bronze bolts, $41, cold. He did not know yet that another ledger existed, older, more careful, written in a hand he would recognize instantly, waiting somewhere he had not yet had reason to look. He knew only that the boat was slowly becoming honest under his hands, layer by layer, the rot cut back to sound wood, and that some nights, working alone with Pomeroy's thermos steam rising nearby, and the harbor bell clanking somewhere out past the breakwater, he felt less like a man restoring a boat than a man being told something, patiently, one plank at a time, by someone no longer able to say it any other way. The bait shop's owner, a woman with forearms like rope and a voice that carried through the floorboards, took to leaving coffee outside his door on the coldest mornings, never knocking, never mentioning it, and he understood this was its own kind of ledger, a debt neither of them intended to speak of, let alone collect. He drank it standing at the window, watching the harbor go from black to pewter to the flat white of a January sky that seemed to promise nothing. And then he went to work, first at the marina where his hands earned an hourly wage, then after, in the cold light rigged up over the Marigold's hull, where his hands earned something else he had not yet learned to name. His aunt called once, in February, and he almost didn't answer. Her voice had the same brightness it always had at holidays, the same performance of warmth stretched thin over something colder beneath. She wanted to know, she said, whether he'd thought any more about selling the slip rights, since he clearly wasn't using them for anything sensible. He told her the boat was being restored. She laughed, not unkindly, which was somehow worse, and said she hoped he knew that sentiment didn't pay marina fees. He said he was aware. She said something about hoping he'd come to his senses before spring, and he said he intended to, and neither of them meant the same thing by it, and the call ended the way most things ended with her, politely, and with nothing settled. He did not tell her about the note. He had not told anyone about the note, folded now soft as cloth in his wallet, 5 sentences in a hand that shook slightly toward the end, as though the old man had been fighting something, even as he wrote it. Finish what we started. He had read it so many times the words had stopped being words and become something closer to a compass heading, a direction he followed without asking why, the way a man follows a coastline in fog, not because he can see the harbor, but because he trusts it is there. By the first week of March, the hull was faired and sound from bow to midships, and he had begun, at Pomeroy's suggestion, to open the aft deck framing, to check for rot beneath the old fish boxes, the boards there swollen and gray, and smelling of a century of brine. It was slow work, done with a flashlight clenched in his teeth, and a pry bar worn smooth by his grandfather's palm before his own, and it was here, prying loose the third board back from the transom, that he first felt something give beneath the wood that should not have given at all, a seam too straight, too deliberate, to be the honest work of rot. He sat back on his heels and did not touch it again right away. There is a particular discipline in restoration work that has nothing to do with tools and everything to do with patience, and it was this discipline, learned across a decade of Saturdays at his grandfather's elbow, that kept his hands still now instead of tearing the board free in the eagerness that would have been forgivable in anyone else. He looked at the seam a long moment under the flashlight's cone. He noticed his breathing had gone shallow and even, the way it does when a man is listening for something rather than looking at it. Outside, the yard was quiet in the particular way boat yards go quiet in early March, the gulls gone somewhere else, the wind coming off the water with a bite that had not yet remembered it was supposed to soften into spring. He could hear Pomeroy's radio 3 sheds down, low and tinny, a ballgame rerun from some warmer month. He did not call out to him. Not yet. He worked the pry bar along the edge of the plank with a gentleness that would have looked, to anyone watching, like a man diffusing something rather than repairing it. The wood came away not in the reluctant, splintering way of rot-softened board, but in one clean piece, as though it had been fitted rather than fastened, as though someone had built it to be removed by exactly this kind of care and no other. Beneath it was not the bilge water and rib timber he expected. It was a narrow cavity no wider than a man's forearm, running along the keel line, and it had been framed in, deliberately, expertly, with lumber that did not match the boat's original construction at all. He shone the light into it and saw the corner of something the color of old rope, waxed and dark, folded with a precision that had survived whatever years it had been sitting there. Canvas, oiled canvas, the kind used for generations to keep water and salt air from ruining what it was wrapped around, folded the way his grandfather had once shown him to fold a tarp so it would shed rain instead of pooling it. He did not reach in. He sat there instead, with the flashlight trembling faintly in his grip, aware suddenly of the cold coming up off the concrete floor, into his knees, aware of his own heartbeat in a way he had not been aware of it in months, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, of the note folded still in his wallet after all these months, finish what we started, and understood, before he understood anything else about what he was looking at, that his grandfather had known exactly where this seam was, and had trusted that only a certain kind of patience would ever find it. He did not touch it for a long while. Instead, he sat back on his heels in the boatyard's cold, letting the flashlight beam settle where it was, and let himself remember something he had not let himself remember in months. His grandfather's hands, thick-knuckled and sun-spotted, folding a tarp over the stern of the Marigold on some forgotten evening years before any of this had begun, saying, almost to himself, "A thing done right doesn't need to be checked twice." He had thought, at the time, that the old man was talking about tarps. The shop around him was silent except for the tick of the space heater cooling in the corner and the faint creak the hull made as the temperature dropped outside. It was late March, and the night still came down hard and clean in that part of Massachusetts, the kind of cold that made metal sing if you struck it. He had been alone in this boatyard for 6 months now, evenings and weekends, the smell of epoxy and cedar dust so constant in his clothes that his co-workers at the marina had stopped commenting on it. He thought sometimes that the isolation had become a kind of shelter, no family dinners to be excluded from, no cousins' engagement parties where his aunt's husband asked, with that particular smile, how the fishing boat business was coming along, just him, and the hull, and the slow correction of a thing that had been let go too long. He reached for the light again and adjusted its angle rather than reaching into the gap, some instinct, the same one that had made him check every through-bolt twice before trusting a repair, the same one his grandfather had drilled into him without ever using the word instinct, told him this was not the moment to hurry. He noted, almost clinically, the way the framing lumber around the canvas differed from everything else he had exposed in 11 months of work. Denser grain, a slightly different cut, fastened with bronze screws instead of the galvanized ones used everywhere else on the boat. Someone had done this deliberately and done it well, and done it so that a person merely replacing rot would never have reason to look twice, would patch around it, would seal it back up without ever knowing what sat 6 inches from their hands. He thought of the sealed envelope waiting at home in the drawer of his nightstand, the note he had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Finish what we started. He had assumed, all these months, that it meant the boat itself, the hull, the engine, the long, slow labor of bringing something back to life. He understood now, kneeling there with cold rising through the concrete and into his bones, that it might have meant something else entirely, something his grandfather had built into the bones of the Marigold long before either of them had begun this work at all. He set the flashlight down at last and reached toward the canvas with both hands. The canvas was stiffer than he expected, oiled to the texture of old harness leather, and it resisted his fingers the way anything does that has been left undisturbed for longer than a human memory can properly account for. He worked the edge of it with his thumbnail first, not wanting to tear whatever lay folded beneath, and when that failed he went back to the truck for the boning knife he used for splicing line, the one with the dull, rounded tip that could not cut skin, even if his hand slipped. He came back and knelt again in the same spot, and the boatyard around him had gone the particular kind of quiet that late March produces in Massachusetts. No gulls yet, no other hulls being worked, only the tide somewhere beyond the breakwater making its patient sound against the pilings. He worked the knife under the fold and drew it along, slow, an inch at a time, the way his grandfather had taught him to open a seized fitting rather than force it. Patience is cheaper than parts, the old man used to say, standing over him with his arms crossed and his glasses fogged from the cold. He heard it now as clearly as if it had been spoken behind him. The canvas parted. Underneath, packed tight against cedar boards cut and fitted with the same care as a hope chest, something caught the flashlight's beam and threw it back gold. He sat back on his heels. For a long moment he did not touch anything. He only looked, at the coins stacked in paper-wrapped rolls, at the dull gray weight of what he understood, without yet lifting one, to be silver, at the corner of an oilcloth packet tucked against the cedar that looked, unmistakably, like pages. His breathing had gone shallow, and he noticed this the way a man notices weather, an observation rather than a feeling, and he made himself take one full breath before he reached in and lifted a single coin free. It was heavier than its size suggested it should be. An eagle in flight, wings spread, a woman striding forward with a torch and an olive branch, the date worn but legible, 1927. He turned it once between his fingers, the way he might turn a fitting he didn't yet trust, checking it from every angle before deciding what it was. Somewhere above him a truck door slammed in the gravel lot, ordinary and far away, and he flinched at the sound the way he had not flinched at anything in 11 months of solitary work. He looked toward the yard's chain-link gate, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching him kneel in the cold with a fortune spread open at his knees like a wound. No one was there, only the wind, moving through the stripped masts of the boats stored for winter, indifferent to what he had just found. He set the coin on the deck beside him, careful, the way he had once set a carburetor part on a clean rag so it would not roll into the bilge and be lost. Then he made himself stop. It was a discipline he had learned in 11 months of solitary work, and it saved him now, the discipline of not rushing the thing in front of him simply because it was extraordinary. He had learned it on smaller repairs, a cracked manifold, a seized shaft, where haste had cost him a full day's labor more than once. A man who tore into a find without a plan, lost track of what belonged where, and what belonged where was, he understood even in that first shaking minute, going to matter enormously. So he did not empty the compartment. He photographed it first, the disposable habit of a mechanic who had spent a decade documenting hull damage for insurance men who never came to look themselves. He photographed the canvas as it lay, the corner he had lifted, the coin beside it for scale. Then he photographed the space itself, the dimensions of the false bay, the way it ran nearly the full length of the aft keel timber, framed in with the same care as any structural member, notched and fitted by someone who had known exactly what he was building and why. His grandfather's hands, he thought. Not a shipwright's hands hired for the season. His grandfather's own hands, 30 years younger, working alone in this same yard, maybe on this same tide. The pages he had noticed pressed against the cedar were not loose. They were bound, a ledger, its cover soft with age, its spine cracked from handling rather than from rot. He did not open it yet. He wrapped it back in its oilcloth fold, the way he had found it, and set it apart from the coins, apart from the ingots he could now see stacked in neat courses like cordwood along the compartment's floor, each one dulled with a film of dust but otherwise untouched by 50 years of tide and damp. He sat back on his heels in the cold and looked at what he had uncovered, and the first clear thought that arrived, once the shock had thinned enough to let a thought through, was not of money. It was of the note in the sealed envelope, folded now for 11 months inside his wallet, until the creases had gone soft as cloth. Finish what we started. He had thought, all these months, that the old man meant the boat, the planking, the caulking, the engine he had rebuilt twice with his own hands, in a rented slip nobody in his family had bothered to visit. He understood now that the boat had never been the whole of it. He looked at the ledger, unopened, waiting. Whatever this was, he understood, was not finished yet either. The wind had come up outside while he knelt there, rattling the tin roof of the boatyard shed in long, uneven gusts, and somewhere beyond the tarps, a halyard was slapping against an aluminum mast with the patient insistence of a clock no one had bothered to silence. He noticed the cold then, properly, the way a man notices a stitch in his side only after he stops running. His knees ached against the marine plywood. His fingers had gone stiff around the flashlight. He set it down, angled so the beam still washed pale gold across the compartment, and for a long moment he simply let himself breathe. He thought of his grandfather's hands, not the hands at the end, soft, spotted, folded on a hospital blanket, but the hands from years before, cracked and tar-stained, guiding his own smaller ones along a length of red cedar, showing him how to read the grain before he cut it. Wood remembers what it's been through. The old man used to say. So do people. Difference is, Wood tells the truth about it. He had not understood at 12 why that mattered. He was beginning to. He reached for the ledger again, but did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he lifted one of the ingots, weighed it in his palm the way he might weigh a fitting before deciding if it would hold, and set it back exactly where it had rested for however many years it had rested there. Some instinct in him, older than greed, insisted that nothing here be disturbed more than necessary until he understood what he was disturbing. He thought of his aunt's voice in the mahogany office 11 months earlier, dry and amused. He thought of his uncle checking his watch. He thought, unbidden, of the beach house key he no longer carried, and the 6 months of holidays he had spent alone in the mechanic's shop with the space heater ticking beside him, and how none of that, in this moment, felt like loss anymore. It felt like the price of admission to something the rest of them had never been willing to pay. He looked again at the ledger, its cover softened and darkened with age, the string wound twice around it in a sailor's knot he recognized. Clove hitch, doubled, the same knot his grandfather tied on everything he meant to keep secure. His hands, he noticed, had steadied. Outside, the halyard kept slapping against the mast, patient, indifferent, the way the sea itself was patient and indifferent to whatever men decided mattered on any given Tuesday in March. He would need light, more light than the flashlight gave. He would need the shop lamp from the truck and coffee, and perhaps the whole of the night ahead of him. He rose slowly, joints protesting, and started toward the door, not to leave, only to bring back what he'd need to read what his grandfather had left for him to find. The truck sat where he'd left it, nose against the chain-link fence, and the walk across the yard felt longer than it should have, gravel crunching under boots that had not been dry since November. Overhead, the sky had cleared to that hard, scoured black that only comes after a cold front, stars close and merciless, and he found himself grateful for the cold because it kept him alert, kept the moment from blurring into something he might later doubt he'd lived. He retrieved the shop lamp, the thermos, a legal pad he'd bought months ago for tracking parts costs and never filled past the 3rd page. He did not call anyone. There was, he understood with a kind of settled clarity, no one to call. Not yet. Not until he knew what he was calling about. Back inside the hull, he set the lamp on an overturned bucket and angled it down into the compartment, and the light did what flashlights never could. It filled the space instead of merely touching it. The canvas gleamed faintly with the oil that had preserved it, and beneath it he could make out the shapes of the coins in their rows, disciplined as teeth, and the dull gray weight of the ingots stacked like cordwood. He did not touch them again yet. He opened the ledger instead, carefully, the spine cracking with the particular sound of paper that has waited a long time to be read. The handwriting was his grandfather's, unmistakably, the same forward slant that had signed birthday cards and repair estimates and, once, a letter to the Harbor Commission arguing against a marina expansion that would have paved over the eelgrass flats. But this was different. Columns, dates, figures in a private code he began, slowly, cross-referencing against the shop's old invoices in his memory, to understand were not code at all, but simple abbreviation. GE, for Gold Eagle. SB, for Silver Bar, dates going back, he realized with a small, cold jolt. 22 years. He read a line near the top. March 2002. Diverted from Q2 disbursement. Reason, same as always. He turned the page. Reason, same as always. Appeared again in June, and again the following March, year after year, like a refrain in a hymn nobody else had been taught to sing. He sat back on his heels, coffee forgotten, and understood that what he was holding was not simply a fortune. It was a record of quiet refusal, 2 decades of a man saying no, in the only language he trusted, to people who had never once asked him what he wanted said. The halyard slapped again. Somewhere down the row, a gull complained about nothing. He turned the next page and kept reading. The light in the shed had gone from the flat gray of early morning to something warmer, more yellow, and he had not noticed the change happening, only that it had happened, the way a tide comes in under a boat without announcing itself. He kept reading. The entries did not accelerate, did not build toward some crescendo the way he might have expected from a man who was, after all, hiding $3 million in the bones of a boat. They simply continued. September 2004, October 2006. A line every few months, sometimes every year. Small numbers accumulating the way rust accumulates, so slowly that no single season shows it, only the sum of many seasons laid end to end. He found, tucked between 2 pages of figures, a single sentence that was not a number at all. They will sell what I built before the funeral flowers wilt, and call it strategy. He read it twice. There was no anger in the handwriting, no underline, no exclamation. The old man had written it the way he'd once told him how to bed a stuffing box, plainly, as a fact to be planned around rather than mourned. He thought of the aunt's voice in the mahogany office, the flat certainty of it. Some things just skip a generation, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in an unheated shed at the end of March, that his grandfather had understood her better than she had ever understood herself. He kept the ledger open on his knee and let the coffee go properly cold. Outside, a truck idled somewhere near the office, its engine ticking, and he heard the yard manager's radio murmuring through a wall too thin to keep out anything. Weather, static, a ball game recap nobody was listening to. He did not move toward any of it. He turned another page and found, near the middle, a line that made him stop entirely. If he is reading this, he has already done the work. That is the only proof I ever needed. He set the page down on his knee, flat, and looked at it as though it might rearrange itself into something less direct if he looked away and back. It did not. The gull outside had stopped complaining. The halyard had gone still, the wind dropping the way it does at the exact center of a slack tide, and in that stillness he became aware, distinctly, of his own pulse in his ears. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to the moment, before a swell lifts a hull and you feel the deck rise beneath you, before your mind has agreed the wave has arrived. He turned the last page of that section. Beneath it, held down by the weight of a folded oilcloth square, was something else entirely. He lifted the oilcloth with the same care he gave to a carburetor gasket that had gone brittle with age, not because it looked fragile, but because he had learned, over a decade of Saturdays, that the things which look sturdiest are often the ones you ruin by being confident. Underneath was a photograph, its edges gone soft and rounded from handling, the kind of wear that comes from a hand returning to something again and again, rather than from neglect. He recognized the boat before he recognized the people in it. The Marigold, hull unweathered, paint the color of a ripe orange, riding low and proud against a dock he did not know, in light that belonged to a decade before he was born. 2 figures stood at the rail. He knew one of them instantly by the set of the shoulders, the way even young the old man had stood, like a person bracing against a wind that hadn't arrived yet. The other was a woman in a plain cotton dress, laughing at something outside the frame, her hand resting flat on the gunwale as though she trusted the boat the way you trust a person. He did not need the penciled note on the back to know who she was, but he turned it over anyway, and there it was, in handwriting steadier than the ledgers from an earlier year of the same man's life. She never once asked what it was worth. She only asked if it would float. He sat with that for longer than he would have admitted to anyone, the shop radio still murmuring its ballgame recap through the wall, the tide beginning, almost imperceptibly, to turn beneath the hull. Outside, the light had shifted the particular amber that late afternoon takes on in early spring, when the sun is low enough to flatter everything it touches, the rust on the trailer axles, the frost-cracked pavement, even the dust motes turning slow circles above the workbench. He noticed he was still holding his breath and let it out, deliberately, the way you release a wrench you've been gripping too hard. He did not yet understand what the ledger meant in dollars. He would, within the hour, once he made himself keep reading past the photograph, past the second and third loose pages tucked beneath it, past the numbers that did not, at first glance, seemed to belong to a fishing boat at all. But in that moment he understood something else first, something that arrived ahead of the arithmetic the way weather arrives ahead of a front. A pressure change in the air before the rain. The boat had never been the small inheritance. The boat had been the test. He folded the oilcloth back, gently, and reached for the next page. The second page was a column of dates, running back further than he expected, nearly 20 years of them, each paired with a figure and a 3-letter notation he didn't recognize at first. Age, then a number. It took him a moment, sitting there with the radio still murmuring through the wall, to understand he was looking at coin denominations, American Gold Eagle. Below that, in smaller and more careful hand, as though the old man had slowed down to make sure he got it right. Double Eagles, pre-33, purchased through Whitfield & Sons, Providence, cash settled. The dates ran from a spring, nearly 2 decades back, to one only 4 years old. Each entry was modest on its own, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, the kind of purchase that could hide inside a company's operating accounts, the way a single grain of sand hides inside a beach. But the column did not stop. It kept going, page after page, and something in his chest went very still and very quiet as he understood that what he was looking at was not an entry. It was a habit, a discipline, practiced in secret for longer than he had been welding hulls for a living. He thought of his grandfather standing at this same bench a decade ago, sleeves rolled, telling him that a boat only ever fails you at the seams you didn't bother to check. He had thought, at the time, that it was a remark about boats. The third page was different, no numbers at all, just a paragraph in the same unhurried hand, and it was here that he made himself slow down, because some instinct told him this was the part meant to be read once, and read carefully. If you are reading this, it began. You have already done the part I could not pay anyone to do for you. He set the page down on the workbench, weighted it against the draft with a socket wrench, and looked instead at the hull rib beside him, at the pale new wood he had scarfed in only that afternoon, sap still faintly sweet where the plane had cut it. The tide had turned fully now. He could feel it in the way the boat shifted against her lines, a small settling motion like something exhaling. He thought of the 6 months he had spent sleeping on a cousin's pull-out sofa, of the invoice for the Marine Survey still folded in his truck's glove box, of the particular silence that had followed him out of the mahogany office in October. None of it had prepared him for the plainness of the old man's language now, nor for the fact that it asked nothing of him except what he had already, without knowing it, agreed to give. He picked the page back up and kept reading. The handwriting grew smaller as it went, the way a man's does when he is trying to fit everything he means before the page runs out. Your aunt believes money is a ledger of who was owed what, the old man had written, and your uncle believes it is a scoreboard. I built this company believing it was neither, that it was a tool like any other, and tools rust when the wrong hands hold them too tightly and never use them. The protagonist read that line twice, then a third time, and found himself smiling in a way that had nothing to do with humor. It was the smile of recognition, the particular ache of hearing, at last and too late, that someone had been paying closer attention than he'd ever let on. He read on. The old man had written of the company's early years, of a warehouse fire in 1974 that had nearly ended everything, of nights spent doing the books himself by lamplight rather than trust them to anyone. I learned then, the note read, that the men who show up when the lights are out are worth more than the ones who only appear for the ribbon cutting. There was no self-pity in it, no accusation leveled directly at his children, only the dry, patient observation of a man who had spent decades watching people reveal themselves through small choices, who visited, who called, who simply showed up on a Tuesday in February with no occasion at all. Outside, a gull complained somewhere over the water, and the boatyard's security light clicked on against the gathering dark, throwing a cone of white across the hull. The protagonist barely noticed. He had reached the part of the letter where the ink changed, a different pen, a later date scrawled faintly in the margin, as if the old man had come back to this page more than once over the years, adding to it the way a man tends a garden he does not expect to see fully bloomed. "You will want to know why here," it said. "Why beneath the boards and not in a vault where any fool with a key could reach it. Because a vault asks nothing of a man. This asked everything. It asked patience. It asked hands willing to get cut and cold and tired for no promised reward." The protagonist set his own hand flat against the new plank beside him, feeling the grain still faintly warm from the day's work, and understood, with a kind of quiet vertigo, that the boat itself had been the test all along. Not a bequest, not an insult, but a question asked in wood and time, waiting years for the one person who would answer it without ever knowing he was being asked. He folded the letter along its old creases, the paper soft as cloth now from years of being opened and closed by someone else's hands before his own, and set it on the workbench where the lamplight would not scorch it. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying in off the water the mineral smell of low tide, mud and salt, and something faintly sweet beneath it, decaying kelp, or maybe just the accumulated years of the boatyard itself, tar and diesel and cedar shavings ground into the gravel. He did not go back to the letter. He went back to the hull. The plank he had been fitting all evening sat half-seated in its rib, waiting for the last of its fastenings, and it was only when he leaned in to check the seam against the keelson that he noticed the wood beneath did not sound the way the rest of the boat sounded. He rapped it once with a knuckle, out of habit more than suspicion, the way he'd rapped every board on the Marigold 1,000 times over a decade of Saturdays. It gave back a flatter note, duller, a sound with something behind it instead of nothing. He knelt lower, running his palm along the seam where the false keelson met the true one, and felt what his eyes had missed in the poor light, a hairline gap, too clean, too deliberate, the kind of joint a careless builder would never have bothered to disguise this well, and an honest one would never have needed to hide. His fingers found the edge of it and stopped there, unmoving, the way a man's hand stops on a doorknob when he already knows what waits on the other side, and is not yet ready to know it on purpose. A thin ribbon of cedar dust sifted down when he pressed harder, and beneath it, unmistakably, the smell of oil, not engine oil, not the brine-soaked grease of the bilge, but something closer to varnish, or to the canvas his grandfather had once used to wrap tools before a long winter's storage. He sat back on his heels in the cone of the work lamp and looked at the seam for a long moment without touching it again, the pry bar resting untouched on the sawhorse beside him. Somewhere behind him the harbor made its small nighttime sounds, a halyard ticking against a mast, a gull complaining once and going quiet, and none of it seemed to reach him. He thought of the letter's line about hands willing to get cold and cut and tired for no promised reward, and understood, with the plain, unhurried clarity of a man who has spent his whole life listening to wood, that he was no longer restoring a boat. He was opening a door his grandfather had built for him 20 years before he'd known to knock. He did not reach for the pry bar right away. Instead, he ran his thumb along the seam again, the way his grandfather had taught him to read a piece of wood before ever putting a tool to it. Feel for the grain. Feel for where it wants to give. This seam did not want to give. It had been fitted with a patience that had nothing to do with haste, tongue and groove sealed with something dark and old that had outlasted 3 decades of bilge water and salt fog. Whoever had built it, and he knew, by now, without needing to be told, had built it to last exactly as long as it needed to, and not a day longer. He worked the bar in at last, gently, the way he'd been shown to lift a hull plank without splitting it, rocking rather than forcing. The seam let go with a sound like a held breath finally released, a long, low groan of old glue and older secrecy giving way, and a section of the lower deck framing lifted clear in his hands, lighter than its size promised, revealing beneath it a cavity no wider than a toolbox and lined, edge to edge, in cedar gone, the color of strong tea with age. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff and dark, sat shapes he knew before he understood, the unmistakable heft of coin rolls, dozens of them, and beneath those, the flatter, denser weight of ingots stacked like cordwood, each one catching the work lamp's glow with a dull, patient shine that had waited in the dark for longer than he had been alive. He did not touch them yet. He knelt there instead, with his hands resting on his knees, breathing the smell of cedar and old canvas, and something that might have been his grandfather's aftershave clinging faintly to the oilcloth, and for a moment the boatyard, the harbor, the whole cold late March night seemed to hold very still around him, as if waiting to see what he would do with what he'd been given. Tucked into the corner of the compartment, wedged where it would not shift with the boat's roll, was a small oilskin packet, tied with the same kind of twine his grandfather had used to bundle nets. He lifted it out first, before the coins, before the silver, because some old instinct in him, the same one that had made him read the letter twice before setting it down, told him that whatever answer there was would be written there, and not in the weight of the metal. He untied the twine with fingers that had gone strangely careful, as if the whole of the last 6 months, the whole of the last decade, might depend on not tearing what was inside. The paper crackled, dry and brittle from years in the dark, and in the lamp's low glow he saw, in his grandfather's unmistakable hand, the first lines of something that had clearly been written not once but many times, over many years, and never meant for anyone but him. The ledger began plainly, the way his grandfather began most things, as though the reader had already been standing beside him for years. If you are reading this, you have done the one thing I hoped for and never demanded. You have finished the work. Below that, dated entries stretched back 22 years, small transfers noted in a cramped, careful hand, coin purchases, a silver broker in Providence, a locksmith who had built the false compartment in 1998 for cash and no questions. Each entry was a quiet subtraction from a company his grandfather no longer trusted to survive its own heirs. The last page was dated the September before he died. They will inherit the company because it carries the name. You inherit the boat because you carried the work. Only one of those things was ever truly mine to give. He sat with that for a long time before he called the harbor's night watchman to help him carry the canvas bundles up into the truck. The estate attorney met him the following morning, reading glasses pushed up into white hair, and did not speak for nearly a full minute after the coins were laid across the mahogany desk in neat, gleaming rows. Your grandfather, the old man finally said, was a more patient man than any of us understood. There was no triumph in the office that day, no raised voices, only the low, steady arithmetic of debts being settled, the truck loan, the slip fees, the boatyard's winter bill, paid in full by early April. The company's troubles surfaced quietly that same spring, the way rot always does, board by board, in an audit no one had asked for. The aunt and uncle kept the $40 million of paper, and the paper, it turned out, had been hollow for years. He restored the marigold through that summer with the same unhurried hands he'd always used, and had her repainted a soft, sun-faded white, her new name lettered across the stern, in his grandmother's honor. By August, she was taking harbor children out on Saturday mornings, their small hands learning the weight of a caulking iron, the give of good wood under a plane. He never spoke of the fortune to reporters, rarely to strangers at all. When people asked how he'd known where to look, he told them the truth, plain as the tide. He hadn't known anything. He had simply kept showing up, the way his grandfather had taught him, long after anyone was watching, long after there seemed any reason to. That, it turned out, had been the entire inheritance. Not the gold, not the silver, but the willingness to finish what was started, quietly, for no one's approval but his own.